Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be taking a look at building the business case for on-site renewables. My name is Stephen Kennett and I look after the energy and built environment portfolio here at 2 Degrees. I'm delighted to welcome our presenters today. We have Phil Roberts, Operations Director from GMI Energy, who has a wealth of experience in this area and is going to take an in-depth look at photovoltaic installations, but will also be able to answer questions you might have around biomass and other renewable heating options. We're also lucky to be joined by Kirsty Rice of the National Trust, who's going to talk about the organisation's plan to deliver a raft of renewable installations across its diverse property portfolio. Today's presentations will take around 35 minutes, which will leave us with 10 minutes for questions at the end. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Just type in your question and press send, and then we'll wait till the end before answering as many as we can. As an aside, if you should have any technical issues during the presentations, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to send me a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Phil, who'll get us started with today's presentation. So over to you, Phil.
Good afternoon, Stephen. So today I'd like to run through some of our experience that we've gained from working with a number of larger clients, such as Morrison's, Tesco, Jaguar Land Rover. We've completed a number of large-scale solar PV projects, one of which is the first slide that we have there, which is Morrison's Bridgewater Distribution Centre. It's the distribution centre at the side of the M5 for anybody that goes down that way, a very large green stripy thing. So we come from a construction background. We're a construction company that's been around for 30 years. We specialised in renewable technologies over the last couple of years and implementation for some of our larger clients who were particularly seeking the background of a construction company combined with the experience to deploy renewables. Renewables have a number of benefits. They are very stable, very good producers of a consistent income. So we'll basically run through why that is, where we have come up with a scheme and the finance inputs behind those schemes, any specific considerations that we need to take into account for the site, what we take in material selection, where PV is going in the future, how it's been influenced by the global market, and a basic summary of the risks and rewards that a project possesses. So, advantages of solar PV, it is a very flexible solution. It can be deployed on a number of buildings. It's easy to scale from the domestic scale down at 1 kilowatt, which is just a number of panels, right through to multi-megawatt sites. As a number of people have seen in the press recently, there are large-scale ground mounts being deployed in the country at the moment, which are ranging anywhere in scale up to, I think the current largest is around about 33 megawatts, which is 33,000 kilowatts. I think with Peterborough Council currently having a planning application in for around about 84 megawatts, which takes some, I think it's about 300 acres. So it's suitable for a range of locations. You can either put it on the ground, on the roof, you can integrate it into facades as BIPV. It's very low maintenance, although it's not no maintenance. The systems do need to be monitored. The systems are all tried and tested solutions. You know, PV was first discovered in the 1840s by Becquerel. Subsequently, the maths behind the systems were verified by Einstein in one of his papers. So it's not something that's a completely new market. Some of the first systems were installed in 1966. And are still performing at around about 80% of the original installed production. So, on looking at the UK and the UK market at the moment, we have most systems that have been installed are around about the 50 kilowatt mark. This is due to the feed-in tariff steps. The feed-in tariff varies at a number of different sizes. So there's a rate that's applicable to up to 4 kilowatt systems. Then there's another rate that's applicable from 4 to 10 kilowatt systems. Another rate for the 10 to 50. Now, 10 to 50 tends to be the area that's deployed by most SMEs. A number of sites are deploying that at the moment as sort of a trial system. As long as you're under 50 kilowatts, you don't need any planning permissions. You still have to apply to the grid to connect, which is one of the main areas of contention for planning a system. And once you go over 50 kilowatts, you still require planning permission. So the systems are a long-lasting system, typically lasting around about 25 years, with an expected lifespan in the region of around 40 years. Although the inverters, which do the conversion from DC to AC, typically only last around about 12 years. But they are typical to any electronic component. As I'm sure most people know, that sometimes you buy a washing machine, it lasts 5 years, sometimes it lasts 20. Inverters are no different. As long as you buy quality components, you can easily see them lasting 20 years. In general, the PV systems pay back in around about 5 to 8 years, and they have a return on investment of somewhere typically up to 18%. But that's very dependent on the location in the country and also the amount of self-use of the generation that you make. And in general, PV systems have a very low carbon footprint, although you do have to be occasionally careful about systems that have been bought from Chinese manufacturers, where the energy that's gone in to produce them is very carbon intensive in terms of coal. But even still, the worst Chinese system will pay its energy back in around about 7 years. Typically, a European well-manufactured system will pay back its energy during the construction of it in around about 2 years. So the government incentives, we have currently feed-in tariff, which gives us around about 50% of the project income. We have the self-use savings, so of what you generate on site, as long as you're consuming that on site, that then contributes around about another 50% of the project income. And then we have export tariff. If you don't use the generation that you get from your solar system on site, it goes off site, and that contributes anywhere between sort of 5 and 20%, depending on the amount of income that's going to be going out from the system. Alternatively, if you have a system that's over around about 250 kilowatts at the moment, although it was originally intended for projects over 5 megawatts or 5,000 kilowatts, you can take an incentive known as ROCs. ROCs are a traded benefit for generated power. So for every 1,000 kilowatt hours that your system generates, you'll get paid. If it's on a rooftop project, 1.6 ROCs, 1.7 ROCs, and if it's on a ground mount project, 1.6 ROCs. Those are due to change next April currently. With feed-in tariffs, they're also more stable at the moment. I know most people will be aware that feed-in tariffs had quite a significant reduction last spell, about 18 months ago now. The current feed-in tariff reduction scheme acts about every 3 months and is only around about a 3.5% reduction at the moment. So the actual reductions that we're seeing come through to projects are very minor in terms of the overall cash flow for a project. So current feed-in tariff rates, they're altering for systems sub 50 kilowatts this month. So the 1st of July, the new rates apply. So there's a minor drop. The 0 to 4 kilowatt rates just come down from 15.44 to 14.9, as is shown on the table. The 50 kilowatt schemes have come down from 13.03 to 12.57. So when you imagine that that's only around about half your project income, you can see that the drop from 13.03 to 12.57 is no longer that much of an issue. But the main issue now tends to be the use of the self-generation. And so sizing a project appropriately and making sure that you're trying to use as much as you can from the generation is more of a critical element. As we go up the larger scale, the 50 to 150 and 150 to 250 rates, they dropped during the last quarter's degradation reviews. And the 250 to 5 megawatts have been fairly static at that rate for a while. Now, if the tariffs don't move, the tariffs moves on a deployment basis, so it depends on how much has been deployed in any one quarter. If the tariffs don't move for 9 months, they then automatically degrade by 3.5%. which was the case with the 250 to 5 megawatts at its last round. So at the moment, the 6.85 probably won't be moving for at least another 6 months. Where are future electricity prices moving? Electricity prices, as most people know, are forecast to increase fairly rapidly over the next 8 years. The DEC forecast at the moment is 8% per year for the next 8 years. And typically we've seen, I know with most of our clients, we've seen around about 10% increases over the last 3-4 years. We do forecast our prices to within our cash flow, project cash flow. We typically use a 5% increase to be on the safe side. But even still, when you look at a cash flow of a project, over the next 25 years, typically the feed-in tariff income will make up around about only a third of the income over the next 25 years, with electric savings making up $1 million. Now, some of you may ask that why is that more when we were stating that, you know, out of the feed-in tariff income and electric savings, they were roughly split around about half each. Well, when we do our cash flow appraisals, we look at the manufacturer's warranty for panels, which is 25 years. Feed-in tariff we only gain for 20 years, so we have a further 5 years after the end of the feed-in tariff before the warranties actually expire on the panels. Not that at the end of the 25 years the system won't be still contributing. Systems, you know, we typically expect to last around about 40 years for the panels, as we said before, with the inverters being replaced somewhere around about every 12 years. So other things that will be contributing to the cash flow of a project. At the moment, there are CRC charges. Now, CRC charges don't actually contribute to a cash flow at the moment. The CRC at £12 a tonne, although I think it's just risen in the last April review. At the moment, they're classified as grid emissions. So if you look at a PV system, the power that it generates is classed as grid emissions for emission standards. And at the end of the 25-year period at the moment, we're assuming that that will no longer be the case. We have contacts within government who have said that it's likely that CRC will no longer include renewable generation, probably in around about 6 months' time. But we don't have full confirmation of that yet. We also include CCL levies within our cash flow forecasting, which is something that you can't get out of unless you've got a climate change agreement. And also there are future possibilities of taxes due to EPC and due to the EPCs and the display certificates. That's what I was trying to think of. They're more than likely to be a forerunner to taxes for carbon emissions. We see that as being a major reason for getting in early while feed-in tariffs are still around and taking advantage of that fact. So finance options. At the moment, we see the majority of clients are actually purchasing systems, whereas we think that over the next, say, 6 to 9 months, we'll see quite a large shift towards finance systems. Up until now, there haven't been many lenders in the market. Lombard have been one of the lenders in the market, but they weren't securitizing feed-in tariff income, and they weren't taking that into project cash flow income against ability to pay on a lease or loan period. We've seen recently a change in that, and that they are now starting to use project cash flows as an income to pay the lease. And we've seen a number of changes to the players in the market that are now offering either 7 or 10-year lease purchase options for PV. As you can see on the screen there, this is a typical project cash flow over a 25-year period, which would be done through a lease. So on the lease system, it's completely 100% funded at day one. You don't require to put any cash into the project at day one. The feed-in tariff income, the self-use generation savings, and also any export contribute towards paying the lease costs. Typically, we find that for a project anywhere from the Midlands down, that there will be more or less 100% self-funding, as long as we're somewhere within 45 degrees of south. East-west, as we get towards the south coast, Southampton and down into Devon, they will look to also be completely 100% self-funding, even though they're only going to be predicting around about 90 to 95% of the yield of a south-facing project. There will, if we go further north, where we're based in Leeds, we typically see that if you have a 50 kilowatt project, that over the first maybe 5 years, you'll be maybe required to put £1,000, maybe £1,500 into the costs to service the lease costs. So a 50 kilowatt system could then cost you anywhere in the region of around about £7,500 compared to a standard purchase price somewhere in the region of sort of 60 to 70,000, depending on the difficulty of the project. So a lease option is an attractive way of purchasing a system. It's also got tax benefits that we don't include within our cash flow because the lease payments are tax deductible. When we produce a project, we do a project appraisal, which I don't know whether you can see, it's not come up quite very well on my machine, but it has the capital costs, the installation cost, any borrowings or equity that you're putting into the project, the annual costs for maintaining an inverter replacement factored in at year 12, and then any interest, loan repayments, and underneath we have the green section, which is the cash inflow, so feed-in tariff, the purchase, the self-use generation of electricity, any revenue from export, climate change levy, anything else that contributes back into there. We produce a return on investment, which is the first figure down the bottom, so the 15.73 figure, and we also produce an internal rate of return. Most of our clients that we generally work for have been developer clients. Developers tend to use the internal rate of return as their bar for selecting projects. And then because the weather does vary from year to year in the UK, we do also an IRR sensitivity based around the yield forecast for the year. We have as you can see in the sort of bottom right corner, we have a -5, +5, +10. We take quite a conservative view of where we get our appraisals from. When we do an initial forecast, we use industry standard tools such as PV-Sol, PV-Syst to do a yield forecast. We then take a degradation model over lifetime because the system will degrade as it gets older, which again is on the safe side. We assume 0.64% per year. We know from Germany that typically comes out around about 0.2, 0.3% per year. We take that forecast out across its lifetime. We apply the feed-in tariff income over its lifetime, again, because feed-in tariff is RPI linked. We apply an RPI increase on an annual basis to the feed-in tariff income. The same with fuel price. We apply a fuel price increase across its lifetime. And you can see that from the totals column on the right-hand side for this particular project, where we're expecting a £60,000 capex, we've got a total project income of around about 300,000. So after costs for O&M, after the initial capex, we're looking at coming out with a total income after costs of around about 205,000 over a 25-year period. So any site-specific considerations that we need to take into account? Well, location, orientation. Obviously, the further south we go, the better it gets. But that's not to say that even sites in the north don't work. I mean, we currently have a site for Morrison's, which is just north of Newcastle, which is actually performing around about 20% better than we thought. We know that from talking to other industry colleagues that the UK radiance maps are a little bit on the pessimistic side. And that currently the UK radiance maps are being rewritten and will be amended probably in around about 6 months' time. DNO connection, that's the grid connection. Another critical area at the moment, as we get more renewable generation onto the grid, they're getting more and more resistant to additional generation coming on, which they can't control. We probably expect that within around about 2 to 3 years, we'll see changes to the DNO requirements, whereby we'll be required to switch off systems at demand. in order to stabilise the grid if there's problems. However, that's not the problem at the moment, and it's a good idea to get in while you can, try and beat those requirements. Planning requirements, as we said, sub 50 kilowatt doesn't require planning. Anything over 50 kilowatts has to go through the normal planning process. On rooftop situated systems, we don't see any issues. We've never had one turned down. Most of the planners are glad to have rooftop systems because they know they're not going to get objections. Shading is a crucial element of design of any of the systems. There are ways round shading. You can put multiple inverters on with trackers which look at separate bits of the system so that you can isolate shading into any one area, or you can use microinverters. Personally, I'm not a fan of microinverters. People that I know in the industry that have used them previously have had problems with them. Structural requirements are also an issue for any project. Fortunately, we have our own structural engineers in-house in group, so we carry out our own structural assessments. But typically, when we've done supermarkets, we know that systems that are not connected to a roof, where we have to use a ballast system, can present some structural problems. But at the moment, we have the systems that we can use to get around that. Panel selection. One that we get a lot of questions on is efficiency. Efficiency is only relevant to space. Whilst it does mean efficiency, if you consider a standard 14% efficient panel, which is a crystalline panel, that takes up around about 350 square metres for a 50 kilowatt system. If it was a 7% efficient panel, which is something like an amorphous silicon panel, all that means is it just takes up twice as much space. So efficiency is only really an issue where you've got a limited roof space and you want to try and achieve a specific number of kilowatt hours from your generation. The yield is another crucial factor that we look for when we're looking for panels. All panels generally are not the same. There are varying degrees of quality of silicon. We take a great deal of care in trying to specify the exact panels with the best outputs. Degradation guarantees do vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, or typically they're around about 80% at 25 years. So we do expect the panels will be still giving a significant proportion of their income still at 25 years, and will do for hopefully many years to come after that. Warranties are typically around about 10 to 12 years on panels, up to 10 years on inverters. They can be extended with additional warranties, although generally we find that the additional warranties tend to be a little bit on the pricey side. Performance. Some manufacturers are better than others at guaranteeing performance in weak light, or whether or not they have the correct certifications for use in coastal locations for salt mist, or in barns on farms for ammonia resistance for cattle. For the future, and why invest now? Prices right at the moment are an all-time low due to the rather large expansion of production capacity in China. We are seeing a current rise in prices due to the anti-EU anti-dumping, which has been on the news of recent. We think that may well sort itself out after Christmas, but it's anybody's guess at the moment. Government incentives, they aren't around forever. They will be phased out over the next few years. As power prices increase, that will be less of an issue, because probably in around about 5-6 years' time, power will be significantly expensive and solar systems will continue to come down in price, and therefore the generation that the system makes, it will be cheaper to buy solar power than it will be to buy grid power. And that's partially due down to the fact that electricity prices will continue to rise significantly over the next number of years. And also carbon legislation. At some point, we're sure that carbon legislation will lead to carbon tax. Why have PV got so much cheaper? Mainly because of the fact that we're expanding the amount of production capacity throughout the world rather significantly. At the moment, we have around about 120 gigawatts installed after the end of 2013, and that deployment rate on a year-by-year basis is growing at around about 20 to 30%. Every time we double the amount of installed base, the cost of PV drops by around 20%. So it's relatively easy to forecast where the PV costs are going over the next few years. So in summary, what are the risks to a project? Well, British weather is a risk. In general, we know from the systems that we've got in, the way that we forecast our systems, we perform as they should be, as they've been forecast. In general, a lot of systems perform over and above that because, like I said about the irradiance levels in the UK, they have been a fairly conservative forecast. System failures are a risk, therefore everything that we put in, we monitor. If you use live monitoring, it minimises the risk that you're likely to lose out on any feed-in tariff income. Performance, again, that refers back to shading and designing a properly designed system. And warranties. A lot of the manufacturers that are out there at the moment are not making money, and they are at risk of consolidation. The market will lose a number of its players, and you do have to be careful about the materials that you choose. So the rewards, it is a reliable, long-lasting system. There are very little variability factors to a PV system. The ROI can be 15% or up. Pricing one last week on the south coast that came out at nearly 22% ROI, but that was mainly down to the fact that they were using everything that they were generating. It was a very large system. It is an infinite and free source. There really won't be any price increase on sun power in the next few years. Most of the larger clients that we see tend to use PV as a hedge against rising electricity. It's not just a green issue. It is a very good hedge because of the predictable costs. And also, it's a great way of receiving an income. We're seeing increasing interest from infrastructure funds, from pension funds, because it does match very well any liabilities that they've got. So the options for finance for renewable heat are very similar to PV. The way that we produce a generation and self-use forecast. Obviously, with biomass, it's very dependent on the particular circumstance of the user. But it's very similar in terms of PV. Relatively easy to calculate. Some great opportunities with biomass at the moment, with paybacks anywhere in the region of 3 to 4 years for systems where they've got good use of heat and 24-hour heat load. And that's me. Okay, so back to Stephen.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Phil. That was a great overview there. So I'm now going to hand over to Kirsty, who's going to talk us through what the National Trust are doing. So over to you then, Kirsty.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to talk to you today about how we've built the case for on-site renewables, and we'll be doing that through a programme of investment for a number of hydro and heat projects over the next 5 years or so to deliver 50% of our energy needs by 2020. As an organisation, we already have around 150 projects installed, and that ranges from a small scale, sort of 500 watt PV panel that supplies an electric motor in Nyman's Gardens in the south, up to a 450 kilowatt pellets boiler in Chirk Castle in Wales. And currently we're installing a 600 kilowatt hydro scheme in Snowdonia. Most of the schemes that we've installed so far have been ad hoc installations, and we've done them because there's been an opportunity of external funding or grants available. And obviously now with the feed-in tariff and renewable heat incentives that have been introduced over the last couple of years, those grants have disappeared. So we felt it was time to have a more structured programme that will deliver our target, but also provide us with some financial income. So just for those of you who might not know who the National Trust are already, we're one of the largest landowners in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We were formed through a Parliamentary Act in 1907, and the purpose of that was for us to be able to preserve land and buildings for future generations to be able to appreciate. And our founders really had a kind of social context. They wanted to make sure that people would always have access to open spaces for years to come. We own a number of mansions. I guess that's primarily how we're known, but we do actually own, over 250 hectares of land, and 42,000 hectares of that is woodland, some of which is ancient woodland. We have around 5,000 members of staff, 60,000 volunteers, without whom we just couldn't operate. Because we're a charity, we rely on membership and visitors to our properties. Of the income that we receive, we spend about 6 million of that a year on energy, and that doesn't include transport, so that's energy that's just used to power and heat our properties and our operational activities. Why are we interested in energy as an organisation? Well, apart from the 6 million spend, we recognise that change is happening to us. And so for every unit of oil we burn, every unit of electricity we use, we're responsible for carbon emissions into our environment. And in turn, that has a direct impact on our properties. So, over the last few years, we've seen issues with heavy rainfall, which has created flash flooding, and that water comes in underneath our doorways, through our basement windows. It gathers on our roofing, for which we have very small guttering, which was installed in previous generations where they didn't really experience this level of flash flooding on a regular basis. And all of that water accumulates and then comes through the roofing, as you can see through that picture of the stairway. We've seen really bad impacts from freakish storms, which have damaged ancient trees, wiped out 200-year-old landscapes. We've also seen where we have periods of drought and rain intermittently, that can cause soil erosion and creates landslides. Particularly, this is a problem for some of our peat land, which is a storage mechanism for carbon. So as soon as that erodes, more carbon is released into the atmosphere. We also are aware that energy prices are increasing, as we've already talked about today. The difficulty for us, and actually for anybody, is knowing where they're going. We know they're going in an upwards direction, but to what extent? And we found it incredibly hard to get people to commit to predictions or projections of energy usage, energy price increases. The closest we have are people like DEC that are pulling a variety of sources together in order for us to make a decision of some sort about whether we need to invest in renewables or not. And as Phil mentioned already, they are using their own mechanism for energy inflation, and we started to develop our own. And it's somewhere between what DEC has stated and what has been a historical pattern for us for our energy usage, and we're using something in between. We produced this slide with the help of Forum for the Future, just so that we could talk internally to our various stakeholders about what the different influences on energy are and why it's so difficult to commit to an energy inflationary price when looking at business cases. So I'm responsible for the energy strategy within the National Trust, and we published the document back in 2010, which had 4 strands to where we wanted to go as an organisation before 2020. And out of that came 2 targets, one of which is energy reduction, which is obviously the first and foremost energy strategy that anybody should have. And then secondly, it was around whatever's left after that 20% reduction, we will generate half of that through on-site renewables. So this is where we are at the moment. We generate around 6% of our own energy. Most of that is through wood-fired boilers, some of which is provided from our own estates, but some of which is through pellets or neighbour chip and local tenanted landowners. They provide fuel sources for us too. What we'd like to do is move over to something more mixed, a better rounded mix of electricity and heat generation. So in 2020, that's what we hope our mix will look like on the right-hand side there. So most of it to come from hydro schemes, and in fact, half of it to be for electricity and the rest of it to be for heat generation. But the pattern of still using biomass will obviously feature quite heavily for us there. In order to develop our business case, we looked at which technologies were appropriate for us, for our properties, but then also where our biggest hits would be. So we looked at our highest oil and LPG, liquefied gas users, and looked to replace those with either biomass or wood-fired boilers or heat pumps. But then we also identified a number of hydro sites in Wales and the northwest region, which had capacity of over 100 kilowatts, and we feel that that's a reasonable indication of the size of system we'd be comfortable installing. But there are some that are much bigger than that, which we might look to do in future years. So we have around 43 projects that we have identified. 14 of those are hydro, 27 biomass, and 2 ground source heat pumps. This is what our program looks like. As an organisation, although money is obviously very important to us, a return on investment is incredibly important, there are other success criteria that we want to measure. So it's more of a triple bottom line approach. So we look at potentially social, environmental impacts together with financial impacts. And you can see that some of the outcomes that we expect to achieve from this are around how we might improve our energy security, how we might become more self-reliant, so harking back to the fact that we don't really know where energy is going and how the UK market will evolve. We also want to reduce our reliance on oil that's used on site at a lot of our properties. So apart from carbon emissions, it has a very real local impact. So if one of our pipes leaks or if our tanks aren't bundled sufficiently, then that can have quite a dramatic impact. And then some of our heating systems are probably very old, quite ancient, ailing, and we'd look to replace those and improve that heating infrastructure. And the green bubbles here just show what we expect the programme to achieve. So we want to meet our target, we want to do it by 2020, and we expect to achieve a particular financial return, and I'll come on to that in the next slide. The projects themselves underneath this programme are also expected to have specific achievements associated with them, and so there are a number of success criteria that they will have to fulfill in order to prove whether they should be within the programme. And if at any time the programme doesn't meet these requirements, then it might mean that either we need to adjust it somehow or we need to stop doing it. So at the project level, we are looking at using measurable criteria, again, such as self-reliance and energy security. What we'd look to do there is potentially for biomass systems, for instance, we would want to use as much fuel or wood resources we could use from our own sites as possible in order to improve that security. If we're generating electricity, we want to use as much on-site as possible rather than simply export to grid. So this is the financial criteria that we've set for the programme. There are two sets of numbers here. One is a hurdle rate and one is a target rate, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. But the target rate is really where we, given a set of factors that are known to us, so building on what we believe the project costs will be, and that includes everything from the kit, the consultancy, project management, grid connection, heat main, potentially building a new boiler house, versus the income and saving side of things. So the income from the RHI, the FIT, and potentially exporting some of that electricity. And then also looking at the savings side, so based on our set of energy inflationary factors, if we get that property off oil, what do we expect that saving to be? And we've looked at this over a 20-year period, so the lifetime of the incentives, basically, although we expect the benefits, the financial benefits, to be beyond that, we've just used the 20-year as an indicator. So the programme as a whole, given the set of parameters, would be expected to achieve 10%. However, if something happens out of the blue that we're not really aware of, we might be expected to take a slight hit, and we would go for an 8% hurdle rate. And that to us means the minimum we could expect to get for the programme. And if it goes beyond that or below that, then we would have to question why we would invest in renewables. And as I mentioned before, as a charity, we are quite tight on our resources, so rather than continuing to stay in the stock market, why would we bring this money over into the programme? And so in order for us to win that argument, we need to have a good hurdle rate for it to continue. And we've got separate factors here for heat projects and electricity projects within the programme. And the reason for that is, or the reason heat is lower, is that we've found in our experience that there's a lot more infrastructure needed for us on some of our sites for our heat projects. And that's because sometimes we have physical constraints about where we can put kit. Sometimes we might want to link up a number of buildings into a mini district heating system, or we might find that actually we can't fit the boilers into the existing boiler house, so we might need to build a new energy centre. So we've tried to account for that lower financial return by separating out heat and electricity projects, just so that the line isn't blurred. When we developed the business case, we looked at a number of challenges and risks which are still around now, which could impact the financial return for any of the schemes. So a couple of them I've already mentioned before, so around the setting and potentially whether that technology even fits in that property. So if I take the first one, landscape setting, if you can take a look at the photo at the bottom there, that's Lindisfarne Castle. And we have some lovely solar panels on that castle, but unfortunately we've had to lay them flat, because if we had them at an angle, you would be able to see them from the ground. And although we do believe in education and engagement, we have to put the historical value of that property first and foremost. So we've had to lay the panels flat in order to not compromise that. So that means we would be prepared to take a hit on the level of energy that will be generated by those, because we all know that if they're flat, they are less efficient, or they might generate less yield. So we would say, okay, we'd be prepared to take a lower financial benefit, but that it means that conversely it doesn't impact our conservation at that property. And then likewise around the building constraints, rather than knocking out a wall or widening a doorway in order to get some kit in, we would have to build a new energy centre for our new biomass system. I've talked about infrastructure requirements, but what I mean there really is around heat main development. And for us it's a particular issue, because if we're laying heat main across an historic property, there might be archaeology considerations. We might have to do a number of studies. There might be ancient trees there, so we could impact their rooting mechanism. So we have to do a number of studies to make sure that any route of a district heating main doesn't necessarily impact the conservation of that site. And then grid connection, again, we've already talked about this, but it can add a significant cost to a project. So from some of our hydro schemes that we've identified in the Lake District, there is limited grid capacity there. So actually, can we even feasibly do these projects? We were quoted by the DNO for one project up there, $1.5 million to upgrade the network. And that's come down now, but at the time it was a bit of a shock, and it really meant, it made us question whether we should even be doing that project in the first place. The other thing is fluctuation around the incentives. So, over the last couple of years, in particular on solar, we've seen a number of changes there. And for us, because we move quite slowly as an organisation, it means we can only really commit to technologies that we feel might be slightly more secure in the incentive availability. So that's why we've concentrated really on heat and hydro for the time being. And then finally, this is again something we've learned from experience. You have to know who you're handing that project over to. Not just because you want them to be happy, but if they're not operating that system as efficiently as it needs to be, then that will compromise your return on investment. And we've had examples of really brief handovers for, say, biomass systems, which aren't the easiest things to operate. And the instructions have been in German, or there's been a really sort of 10-minute brief discussion about never press this button. And then the installer walks away. So there's a lot there around education and making sure you get the most out of your system by providing your staff with the confidence to use it. These are options that we looked at. I'm sure there'll be many others that you know of. I won't go through this in detail, but there are 4 main options we've looked at here, and a final one there around partnership. So the first one was energy performance contracts, and for us, there are a number of advantages and disadvantages associated with each of these. With the performance contract, the main advantage for us would be that we would not need to manage that system at all. Somebody pays for it, they come in, they install it, and then they simply recharge you for the heat that's generated. We found that because of our charitable status, there was a question mark around whether there'd be a leasing requirement for that building that the kit would be located in. We also found that because we have a lot of access to a lot of woodland, we might like to use our own fuel within the contract, and a lot of EPC providers aren't geared up to do that. So we haven't said no to this option. It's just something that we would consider to be less favourable than others. Then there's the straight bank loan option, so the financing element. And of course, the benefit to that is releasing capital so that you don't need to invest up front. But again, there's a charge associated with that. And actually, if you have that funding available yourself, perhaps you'll be able to make a better financial case by investing and creating savings and getting the feed-in tariff RHI income. We also found that money in itself is quite a nice offer, but we prefer it to come with other expertise, which is why we also looked at the joint venture option. So here we think that if we went into a joint venture with someone, we'd want them to bring something to the table with us, and that might be that they have experience in legal implications of us as a charity versus them as a commercial organisation. We might also look at them bringing in their technical expertise. So although we have a lot of experience in certain technologies, they might be able to improve that. And as a result of that, obviously we'd have to take a lower return on the investment. In addition, there'd be a number of complications for us because we would need to form a separate entity with that organisation, and we would need to report separately to Charities House, which also has a number of additional reporting complications. And then finally we looked at the developer lease, and this is something that we haven't ruled out completely for some other projects, but we don't feel that it's appropriate to include in our programme as such. Mainly because we want to feel ownership of the energy we generate. We don't really want to farm it out. And in order for us to recognise the contribution to our energy strategy, we'd like to own that piece of kit and the energy that it generates. And finally there, I've mentioned partnership. We have a partner in Good Energy. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but they're a smaller energy supplier, so not one of the big six. And they are working with us to help support the financing for our renewables programme. And the way it works is that for every new customer they get in, they then provide us with a donation towards the renewables programme. And there's a link at the end of this presentation in case you want to find out a bit more about how that works and whether it would be appropriate for you. These are the 5 projects that we've decided we will embark on, first of all, as part of the programme. So we've got 5 pilot projects, 2 hydro schemes, 2 wood-fired boilers and 1 heat pump. And overall, we expect this pilot phase to provide us with a just over 10% return on investment. We expect the hydro schemes to provide us with 11% and the heat just under 10%. Some of these are pretty exciting projects for us, so there are other benefits to just providing contribution to our targets and income generation. The Plasnewid one in Wales is a marine source heat pump which is to be put into the Menai Straits. So a really quite exciting project in terms of the challenges that presents. That environment is particularly harsh, so we've had to do a number of research studies to ensure that whatever we put in there will still be there in 20 years' time. But by putting in that heat pump, it will take that property off oil 100%. And it's one of our biggest oil users in the trust at the moment. Another exciting one for us is Stickle Gill, which is a pub that we've just taken back in hand. Well, the Stickle Gill isn't a pub, obviously, it's a water source in a valley, but it has a pub at the bottom that produces its own gin, which we're hoping that it might become the very first hydroelectric gin manufactured and/stroke pub in the UK. And then finally, there's my contact details and the link to the Good Energy Partnership information if you want it. And I shall be pleased to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kirsty. That's a fascinating insight into what you're doing as an organisation. So I think we'll pick up straight away with a question for you, Kirsty. And someone from Essex County Council is really interested in the business case which you put forward. They're saying one thing they're looking at. They're quite interested in restoring some of their county's historic water wheels and windmills to produce energy. But they've got no idea whether or not this might be cost effective. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is there any experience from the projects you're working on which you might be able to sort of provide?
Yes. We as an organisation, we have a lot of historic mills. We would love to bring them back into use again, but as a financial project, it just doesn't stack up. If you want to do it for other reasons, so bringing back the historical context, then that might be enough of a reason to take a lower hit. But for most of our projects where we have done this, so I'll give you an example. We've got Morden Hall, which used to be a snuff mill, and there were 2 water wheels that used to be on site, one of which has just degraded over the years. We reinstated the wheel, but the draw on that just wouldn't have been enough really to generate electricity. So we ended up putting in an Archimedes screw at the same site, and just sort of linking the story together rather than using it as an electricity generation opportunity. We, again, wouldn't have been able to do that without the European grants, just because our internal finances probably wouldn't have stacked up to do it for money alone, which is a really sad case, I think.
Great, thank you, Kirsty. Phil, got one here for you. I know you sort of touched on this in your presentation anyway, but someone's asking about the impact that import tariffs on Chinese photovoltaic panels might have on the business case.
Certainly for ground-mounted systems, they're very large scale. We see that having a fairly significant impact. But for roof-mounted systems, because the income profile is slightly different in that certainly probably half of the income profile is from self-use generation, it doesn't have as much of an effect. The increase in material price doesn't have as much of an effect as you might think. We're only seeing project returns drop by around about 2% on the IRR. Obviously, that's based around the current current anti-dumping rates of 12%, but whether or not the actual rates will increase to the full 50%, we're not overly sure. And even then, there are other manufacturers. We tend to use a manufacturer called REC, who are originally a Norwegian company, but now manufacture in Singapore. Because they're manufacturing in Singapore, they're not Chinese, so it doesn't have any effect on their prices. We are seeing most of the manufacturers, of course, take advantage of the fact that the Chinese prices are going up. But not too much of an effect at the moment on rooftop projects.
Great, thanks, Phil. I'm conscious of time, but I think we've got enough for a couple more questions. So, Kirsty, another one for you. Someone's asking about hidden costs. So, particularly when you're dealing with historic properties, are there sort of a lot of hidden installation costs which you're starting to come across when you're tackling projects?
Not so much hidden as such, but something which we didn't necessarily think about in the beginning were some of the really basic elements like insurance or business rates, tax implication on the income that you might be getting in from the feed-in tariff renewable heat incentive. So I think those typically are quite hidden from many business cases, but actually they apply to all organisations really. The only surprises that have come up for us are where we've hit, I guess, old infrastructure underneath buildings or within lands that we didn't know existed. So we tried to put in a hydro scheme in Yorkshire, and we came across an old water well which didn't come up on the surveys. So that has suddenly added about 50 grand to the project, unless we can find another way of another route for it. So it's just make sure you do the surveys, but also understand that there are costs that aren't typically included in business cases, which have a knock-on impact on your operating costs.
Great, thanks, Kirsty. And finally, Phil, another person is asking, what impact will the proposed changes to the renewable heat incentive have on a business case? Have you sort of crunched any numbers yet, and presumably it's going to be good?
At the moment, no, we haven't actually. But looking at it, it can only be good. It just depends where they're going to go with it, just quite how much they're going to give us. But again, with DEC, it's never the easiest thing to try and predict what they're going to do.
Sure. Okay, great. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but I'd like to thank Kirsty and Phil for their time and for getting through so many questions, and also to everyone who's joined us for this webinar. Just to remind you, a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will be archived on the 2 Degrees platform. And for the questions which we haven't had a chance to get through in the live Q&A, we'll post in a forum and try and get some answers to those there. So thanks again, and hopefully you can join us for further webinars in the coming weeks. So thank you.